On the morning of the 5th of March, 1776, British officers in Boston looked south and saw something that should not have been there. During the night, the Americans had built an entire fortified position on Dorchester Heights. Earthworks covered the hill. Thousands of soldiers stood behind them, and heavy cannons now pointed directly toward Boston Harbor and the British fleet anchored below. General William Howe immediately understood the danger. If those guns remained on the heights, the Royal Navy could be torn apart inside the harbor. The British Army could attack the hill, but that meant charging uphill against prepared defenses and loaded cannons less than a year after a similar assault at Bunker Hill had cost them more than 1,000 casualties. The British had occupied Boston for almost a year. Within 12 days, they would abandon it. But the operation that forced them out had not begun on Dorchester Heights. It had begun 56 days earlier, more than 300 miles away, with a 25-year-old bookseller trying to move nearly 60 tons of iron through the dead of winter. His name was Henry Knox. And when the mission began, almost no part of it should have worked. By the autumn of 1775, George Washington had the British Army surrounded inside Boston. Thousands of colonial soldiers occupied the roads and hills outside the city. British troops could not safely march into the countryside without risking a major battle. But this was not a real trap. The Royal Navy controlled Boston Harbor. British ships could bring in food, ammunition, reinforcements, and everything the army needed to remain inside the city. Washington had enough men to surround Boston. He did not have the firepower to threaten the fleet or destroy the British fortifications. The siege had become a stalemate. Washington could order an assault, but the Americans would have to cross open ground against professional soldiers protected by earthworks and naval guns. He could continue waiting, but every month tested an army that was already short of gunpowder, food, clothing, and enlistment time. Boston was surrounded, but the British were not leaving. The weapons Washington needed already existed. Months earlier, American forces had captured Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point in northern New York. Inside those forts were heavy cannons, mortars, and other artillery abandoned by the British. There was only one problem. The guns were more than 300 miles from Boston. Between them and Washington's army stood lakes, rivers, forests, primitive roads, and the mountains of western Massachusetts. Winter was approaching. Many of the cannons weighed several thousand pounds. Moving even one would be difficult. Washington needed dozens. The man who believed it could be done had never attended a military academy. Henry Knox had owned a bookstore in Boston. He sold histories, maps, political works, and military manuals. He read the books before placing them on his shelves. He taught himself about fortifications, mathematics, engineering, and artillery. When the revolution began, Knox left the city and joined the colonial forces surrounding it. He was young, large, energetic, and so enthusiastic about cannons that Washington quickly noticed him. Knox proposed bringing the captured guns from Ticonderoga to Boston. It was the kind of idea that sounded simple when spoken inside a headquarters. Go north, collect the artillery, bring it back. But Knox was proposing to move some of the heaviest objects in North America through a wilderness with almost no proper roads. During a season when one broken sled or one weak patch of ice could bury a cannon at the bottom of a river. Washington approved the mission. On the 16th of November 1775, Knox received orders to bring the artillery to Boston, while avoiding no reasonable effort or expense. He was 25 years old. He expected the operation to take roughly 2 weeks. It would take 56 days. Knox reached Fort Ticonderoga in early December and began selecting the weapons. He chose 59 pieces of artillery. They included iron and brass cannons, mortars, and howitzers, including massive guns capable of firing 24-pound cannonballs. Together, they weighed nearly 60 tons. There was no single road connecting the fort to Boston. The first part of the journey had to be made by water. The guns were lowered toward Lake George, loaded onto small boats, and pushed south before the lake could freeze completely. The mission nearly ended before the overland journey even began. One overloaded boat carrying some of the heaviest artillery ran into trouble and sank. The guns disappeared into the freezing water. Knox's men could have abandoned them, but every hour spent recovering the cargo increased the chance that the lake would freeze and trap the rest of the convoy. Instead, they emptied the boat, raised it, recovered the weapons, and continued south. At the end of the lake, Knox faced the true problem. Water could carry the weight, land could not. He ordered the construction of 42 exceptionally strong sleds and began searching for teamsters, horses, and oxen powerful enough to pull them. His plan depended on winter. Snow would allow the sled runners to slide across roads that ordinary wheels could not survive. Frozen rivers could become temporary bridges. But winter refused to cooperate. Some roads did not have enough snow. Some rivers had ice that looked solid until thousands of pounds of iron moved onto it. A cannon could travel safely for hundreds of yards and then suddenly break through. Men tied ropes around the guns, pulled them out of the water, repaired the sleds, and tried again. When the ice was too thin, Knox ordered water poured across its surface, so the cold night could freeze another layer. Every crossing became a calculation. How thick was the ice? How heavy was the cannon? How many horses could move onto the river without breaking it? And how much time could they spend waiting before the entire mission fell behind? Then came the Berkshire Mountains. The roads climbing through western Massachusetts were little more than narrow tracks cut across steep hills. The horses strained against the harnesses. Sled runners slipped backward. Men walked beside the guns, pushing against wheels and ropes while trying to keep thousands of pounds of iron from sliding downhill and crushing the teams beneath them. Knox later wrote that it seemed almost miraculous that people carrying such heavy loads could travel across those hills at all. The expedition survived because it became larger than the men who had started it. Farmers along the route brought fresh animals. Local laborers repaired broken sleds. Villagers provided food, shelter, and information about the roads ahead. At the worst climbs, men who had never joined the army helped pull the guns upward. The cannons belonged to the Continental Army. Moving them became the work of entire communities. Day after day, the train continued east. Horses failed, harnesses broke, sleds overturned, cannons crashed through ice. The men were cold, wet, exhausted, and far behind the schedule Knox had imagined. But they did not lose the artillery. On the 25th of January 1776, after 56 days and more than 300 miles, Knox's train reached Washington's army outside Boston. 59 pieces of artillery had crossed the wilderness. The weapons once useless inside an abandoned northern fort were now within range of the most important British position in New England. But Washington could not simply begin firing. Boston still contained thousands of civilians. The British fleet could answer from the harbor. Once the cannons revealed their position, the British could attack before the Americans completed their defenses. Washington needed the guns placed somewhere the British could not ignore. That place was Dorchester Heights. The hills stood south of Boston and overlooked both the city and the harbor. Whoever controlled them could threaten British ships, transport vessels, and defensive positions. The British understood their importance. So did Washington. The problem was building a fortified artillery position before the British could stop it. For weeks, the Americans prepared materials that could be moved quickly onto the hills. Then Washington chose the night of March 4th. American artillery opened fire from other positions around Boston, distracting the British and covering the noise of movement. Thousands of soldiers and local volunteers crossed the frozen ground toward Dorchester Heights. They dragged Knox's cannons behind them. The men worked through the night. Instead of slowly digging traditional earthworks, they assembled fortifications from materials prepared in advance. Wooden frames were raised. Bundles of brush were stacked. Earth and stone filled the spaces. Hay helped hide and soften the sounds of wagons, tools, and moving guns. British sentries could hear activity in the darkness, but they could not see how quickly the position was growing. By sunrise, Dorchester Heights had been transformed. The British had gone to sleep looking at an open hill. They awoke facing a fortress. Heavy cannons overlooked the harbor. American soldiers stood ready behind new defenses. One British officer compared the work to something created by magic. Admiral Molyneux Shuldam warned Howe that the fleet could be shot to pieces if the Americans remained on the heights. The British commander had two choices: attack immediately or leave Boston. Howe prepared an assault. Thousands of troops were placed aboard boats to cross toward the heights. But before the attack could begin, a powerful storm struck the harbor. Wind and rough water made the landing impossible. By the time the storm passed, the Americans had strengthened the fortifications even further. An assault now risked another Bunker Hill, except this time British soldiers would be climbing toward heavy artillery. Howe abandoned the attack. The evacuation began. Boston descended into confusion. Soldiers loaded weapons and supplies onto ships. Loyalist families rushed to escape with the army. Horses and heavy equipment were abandoned to create room aboard crowded vessels. Some residents feared the British would burn the town before leaving. On the 17th of March, 1776, most of the British army sailed from Boston toward Halifax. Nearly 11,000 soldiers, loyalists and family members left aboard a fleet that may have included around 170 vessels. The city the British had occupied since the beginning of the war returned to American control. Washington had forced one of the most powerful military forces in the world to abandon Boston. And he had done it without ordering the bloody assault many people believed would be necessary. The cannons on Dorchester Heights did not have to destroy the British fleet. They only had to make its destruction possible. That was Henry Knox's victory. He had not defeated the British by firing 60 tons of artillery. He had defeated them by placing it on a hill where they could no longer ignore it. Knox began the war as a bookseller who had taught himself how cannons worked. Less than a year later, he had carried an arsenal across frozen rivers and mountains. He had broken an 11-month siege and helped give the Continental Army its first major strategic victory. The British had ships, professional soldiers, fortifications, and control of one of the most important cities in America. Henry Knox had 42 sleds, teams of exhausted horses, and an idea that should have collapsed somewhere beneath the winter ice. The British held Boston for almost a year. A bookseller forced them out without needing to fire the shot that destroyed them.